Welcome back to Financial Therapy. It's not just about the money. I'm personal financial planner, columnist, and financial therapist Rick Kahler. Research tells us that 90% of all financial decisions are made emotionally, not logically. For nearly 4 decades, I've been helping people make better money decisions. So what makes my financial worldview different from most financial experts? I blend the nuts and bolts of financial advice with the emotions that drive making them. Good money decisions are not just about the money. So let's get started with today's episode. Welcome back to another edition. When I hear various words, which is all the time, I subscribe a meaning to them. To anything, and financial words like retirement or mutual funds or whatever the word is, I take the definition in my mind and apply it to that term. And it's not going to surprise anybody that oftentimes when two people are talking using a word, any financial term or any term as far as that goes, people will hear very different things. And I've talked about before on the podcast that there was a gentleman once that was talking about retirement. And in the course of the conversation, it appeared that it just didn't seem we were on the same page in talking about retirement, because to me, retirement is when a person stops working for an income. And I asked this particular person, what is retirement to you? And kind of cocked his head and thought a little bit. He said, it's when I die. Okay, no wonder we weren't having the same discussion. Two very different meanings, and he's not the only person that's given that definition to retirement over the years. So, in the same vein or manner, when I hear somebody use the word inflation, more recently it feels like it's kind of that same awkward discussion I had around the word retirement, because what I term inflation and how when I hear other people talking about inflation, I just am having such a hard time understanding this huge difference. For example, when I use the term inflation, I'm typically talking about the Consumer Price Index, which is calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. CPI is designed to measure inflation over a period of time, which is the change in prices that are paid by consumers for a basket of goods and services that they put together, where they feel it's a fair representation of things that can be purchased or services that can be engaged. So currently, that rate is around, I think it's about 3.4%. For the quarter century between 93 and 2008, it averaged 3.3%. And that, when you look at a 50-year average, is pretty close to the 50-year average, even given the low inflation we've had over most of the last 20 years, and then the very high inflation we've had more recently. So, by my standards, inflation is at its historical average. It's well under control. It's come down from around 9% to 3% in the fastest time ever to make that great of a percentage fall. So I'm just not seeing that there's inflation. And yet, when I read articles in the media, when I talk to people, when I listen to politicians, all I'm hearing is how high inflation is. The facts just don't support it. And I'm like, what's wrong with people? Inflation is not high. Has it been high? Yeah, it was 9% here a couple years ago, maybe. But it was pretty much a blip, and it's come back down to normal level. So I have talked about this. I've written about it. In one article, I called it the Mars bar effect, that people are seeing the effects of the high inflation that we had for a period of time. And they see that in items they purchase very frequently, like Mars bars and food. But other items, big ticket items like TVs and cars and things like that, have actually dropped in price. They don't buy those as often, so they're not reminded as often that there actually have been price adjustments. Well, I read an article in Axios. It's written by Mike Allen. It's the May 26, 2024. That really opened my eyes. And the title of the article was "The New Inflation." And what he's suggesting was the definition of inflation has been changed by about half the country. Now, and it's been changed to really mean high prices. So if I just would insert, when I hear how high inflation is, how high prices are in the context of much of what I'm hearing and reading from consumers and a lot of politicians, then I get it. Then that makes some sense to me. So what I am surprised about is that we've changed the meaning of inflation. And I guess in a world today of alternative facts, this shouldn't surprise me as much as it has. So basically, the definition of inflation has been commandeered to mean something else. If this was a bill in a legislative process, it would be called hog housing. And hog housing is when you have a bill and the time to introduce new bills has passed, and there's a bill that maybe has been tabled or floundering. The legislators go in, just strip that bill of everything, and then put in a new, quote, amendment, which is a whole new bill to move it forward and get things done. So from that definition, I think inflation has been hoghoused to mean something that bears little resemblance to the original meaning. So inflation, like many, many other things now, means different things to different people. So in this article, they brought out that many people perceive that inflation is 19.3%. Well, that's the cumulative price increases over the last few years, especially since the pandemic, that prices have gone up. That is not inflation, which, like I said, is around 3.4%. And so oftentimes in an inflationary economy, when prices are rising, it's not very often that prices fall. When you have a severe inflation, typically prices don't fall unless you have a deflation. So it's a little bit different, where we saw the actual prices of some things fall. But I think maybe they adjusted so high, and it especially was driven by the supply chain issues of the pandemic, which was obviously very abnormal, that we did see some prices come down. But typically, when you have inflation and prices rise, prices typically don't come down. They stay, quote, high, but it's a new high. It's a new normal because they're high because the purchasing power of the dollar has fallen. So, I know that's probably more numbers than some of you would appreciate, and your head's probably swimming right now. But that's kind of the base of it. The whole point is we've commandeered what inflation means. Now, when it comes to economic terms, this is not unusual. And I've written a couple of columns in the past, maybe about 5 years ago or so, where I took a look at the words socialism and capitalism. And like inflation, there are some definite misconceptions of these words in the general public. And it took me a while to understand this because I see so much of the left, typically, just being anti-capitalists and against capitalism. Capitalism is the worst thing in the world. And then I look at the data, and capitalism has done more for this country in 150 years than it's done for countries over thousands of years. It's raised the standard of living to something so high that most of us obviously expect it as the norm as compared to past civilizations of even 200 years ago. So I'm like, what's the deal? Capitalism is giving them a lot of the wherewithal to be able to focus their lives on complaining about it. And then on the far right, we see, or we hear a lot about socialism and how our government's becoming socialist and how socialism has taken over the Scandinavian countries and some significant fear about socialism and that this is what the extreme left is wanting to bring. So I dug into that a little bit and found out that the pure terms of when they're using these terms socialist and capitalist, the context in which those terms are being used are not the context of the actual definition. For example, socialism often is opposition against higher taxes and larger government safety net or government services, rather than a rejection of the traditional definition involving the state ownership by the means of productions. For example, the Scandinavian countries have very capitalistic societies, capitalistic markets. And in the same vein, the criticisms of capitalism and being anti-capitalism often are targeting abuses such as greed and corruption, rather than the fundamental principles of free and open markets and private ownership. Um, Many push back very hard that capitalism in and of itself is not corrupt and does not cause greed. And I've written about that. I think I've probably done podcasts on that. Because for capitalism to work, it needs an environment of virtue. It needs honest weights and balances. And greed is a condition of the human heart. You can be a socialist and be greedy as can be, and a capitalist and be greedy as can be, and it has nothing to do with the economic system. All right. So next time somebody talks about inflation, capitalism, or socialism, you might want to ask them what their definition is, especially of inflation, which is the focus of what I'm talking about here. Is their definition of inflation high prices, or is it the consumer price index? This is going to help move that conversation ahead when you understand what they're talking about. All right, so that's the financial part of the podcast today. Let's look at the therapeutic part. Why do some people just persist in maintaining and doubling down on their erroneous beliefs about inflation? Just simply ignoring the definition and redefining reality. Because oftentimes when you do attempt to correct somebody saying, well, you know, inflation's low. Here's why. Here's the CPI. You will not be met with, oh, I didn't realize that. You'll be met with, no. What are you smoking? Inflation is high. Just look at the prices at the grocery store. So why do people continue to double down and to adopt what would seem to me, coming from where I'm coming from and coming from the definition of what the word actually means, when we see this irrational behavior on their part? And it becomes very logical because we know every belief, every behavior, no matter how illogical it is to you or other people, is logical when we explore the underlying belief system. And in this case, we're going to explore the cognitive biases. Now, I've talked about cognitive biases on the podcast many, many times, and I thought it'd be interesting to look at what cognitive biases are operating with the redefinition that inflation means high prices. So, the first thing that I came across, which will be of no surprise to you, is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is where a person searches for, interprets, remembers information that confirms their preconceptions, confirms what they think is true. And so this is a very selective listening, which will cause a person to look and gather that information that agrees with the view that inflation is high, that inflation is high prices. And the ability then to disregard anything contained in a news story or by somebody with an opposing view on a news show that may talk about official CPI data. There also could be some people that when they hear official CPI data, where does that come from? It comes from the government that will automatically reject that as being accurate data because it comes from the government. So a person with confirmation bias basically is going to seek out instances of high prices that reinforce that belief. What are the emotions behind that? The emotions can be fear of being wrong. What does that mean if I'm wrong? It could mean I'm a failure. It could mean I'm defective. It could mean that I will be rejected by people if I'm wrong. The only way to gain acceptance is to be right. And of course, we know that many of these beliefs, often we can trace back to childhood when they first really solidified within the system. Another cognitive behavior is anchoring, called anchoring bias. This is where we really we cling to the first piece of information encountered when making a decision. And this can cause us to anchor this information within us. So, for example, the perceived price increases of the pandemic, where we ignore the CPI data. The anchoring is clinging to the price that was back before the pandemic. The anchoring could be clinging to the initial high inflation figures of 9% that was reported. The anchoring could be clinging to the 19.3% that prices have gone up during this period of time. Whatever that piece of data is, and it could be a piece of data that also is involved in confirmation bias, to where, yep, see, I knew it was true. And again, the same emotions can be evolved in this, in the anchoring, the fear of being wrong, that the number that we've just firmly entrenched in our mind could be wrong, and what that says about us, and what that says about my integrity, or, smart people are just not wrong. Or other people could be wrong, but not me. It can just go on and on. Another cognitive bias is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this is where people with low ability or knowledge overestimate their competence. And I don't mean that in a shaming way. Just not all of us are knowledgeable or skilled in everything, right? And a lot of folks do not have a lot of knowledge when it comes to finance and how money works. And yet the money script is, you should understand this, that they may believe. That if I don't understand it, I'm stupid, which can result in them asserting incorrect definitions of inflation, and not wanting to back down, because that could mean I'm not knowledgeable, that I don't really understand, and I want to give that appearance I understand, because I want connection, I want belonging. And so they really anchor that into themselves. Another one is the backfire effect. This is a new one. When I was researching this, I came across, and this is a phenomenon where people react to disconfirming evidence by strengthening their beliefs, which leads individuals to double down on their misconceptions when confronted with something like the CPI data. So when I see evidence that comes to me that is opposite of what I believe, I double down and state my inaccuracy even louder, even stronger. We see this everywhere in politics today, don't we? And the last heuristic that I dug out that applied to this is the availability bias or heuristic, which estimates that the likelihood of events based on the availability in my memory. So the more recent something is, like recent price hikes, dominates my thinking, and that leads to overestimation of the overall rate of inflation. Well, look at how high they've gone. Look at how prices go, and inflation is high. And so that's there's a lot more data available right now in the popular press and on television news shows, cable TV, about how high inflation is than how low it is. So emotional drivers hold all of these heuristics in place. And the big one is the fear of being wrong. And I recently had a column on the power in saying I'm wrong. I may have even done a podcast on that. So it's just important that we understand these biases. It's important we understand them in ourselves. It's important that we understand them in those that we're talking to. Again, it's probably not going to serve you well telling somebody they have a cognitive bias, but it can really help stabilize all those parts of you that get upset when you hear inaccuracies like this, and help them regulate when you understand, oh, I see the confirmation bias going on here. I understand the backfire effect. So hopefully that's helpful to you and something that can be useful in your next dialogue with somebody about how high inflation is. So thanks for joining me. I appreciate you listening to the podcast. And I look forward to chatting with you next week. Take care. Thanks for joining me, Rick Kahler, for another episode of Financial Therapy. It's not just about the money. This is where I combine the nuts and bolts of financial advice with the emotions that drive making them. Remember, every financial behavior, whether it appears illogical to you or others, makes perfect sense when we understand the underlying beliefs, feelings, and thoughts. Sign up for my weekly blog at financialawakenings.com. I hope you'll join me again for our next episode.